Thank you, Pat, for sharing that with us this morning. That's the famous love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13. And again, it's good to be with you this morning. And if you remember last week, we mentioned that over the course of the next 10 weeks or so, we were going to be looking at several building blocks of community. Remember, if you were here last week, I had a little table set up, and we were making all kinds of strange contraptions up here with the blocks. Here's one of the blocks this morning, and we talked about each of these building blocks that we're going to look at are important God-given design characteristics for our lives, which undergird healthy relationships. Healthy relationships with God, with those around us. And these characteristics are not just theological truths that the Bible speaks about, but they're things that Jesus ultimately desires for us to put into action in our lives. As we put these traits, these characteristics, these building blocks of community into our lives, we're going to find that we ourselves grow and are blessed by them as well as those around us, and we are living into our God-intended design, the way God has designed us as people to live. And so last week we kicked off our series by exploring the truth that we are created for community. That specifically God's original design for us is to not be alone. We are created with this innate need, and as we looked at last week, not just for God only, that it's only God that I was created for, just this relationship with God. No, God created us with an innate need for both Him and for others. We looked at the story in Genesis about how Adam was created, and God made it very clear that Adam was alone. But Adam really wasn't alone. Adam had God. But according to God, Adam did not have a partner, did not have a relationship, did not have community with someone like him in order to develop and to grow as an individual. And so it was not good that he was alone in that context. Even though he still had God, he was alone. So God created us with the need for one another, as well as obviously our need for Him. And He desires for us to experience life-giving community with Him and with others, because it's essential to our survival and growth. So this week what we're going to do is we're going to explore our very first building block. And this is going to be a bit of a repetition probably for some of you, because I think I recently did a series or a message related to love. I've talked a lot about love recently, which is not a bad thing, because love is the most predominant theme in the entire Bible. But the first building block is a very foundational block to our structure of building effective and effective community as a church and with one another and in our relationship with God. And that building block is love. This is a foundational building block. You could say the cornerstone. And they talked about Jesus being the cornerstone in terms of that really important piece that actually allows the whole structure to kind of be built and to find an established foundation and rooting. As we look at this morning, we're going to talk about love in that context of being foundational to the development of this healthy community that God has called us to experience with Him and with others. Okay, so this is the first building block, the building block of love. I didn't write love on it because this is actually a real Jenga piece and I didn't want to destroy it with a pen. But anyway, so that's what that block represents. Now, if we were doing a straight English definition for the word, or definition search on the word love, we find that there are lots of different descriptions out there about what love is, how we define love in our context and our culture today. Love can be talked about as a feeling of warm personal attachment that we have. Like I think of this attachment that I have. I love my children, right? So there's this affection, this deep love that I have for an attachment to my family. We use love to talk about an affectionate concern for the well-being of others. So like when we love our neighbor, like there's a sense of like we love, the love that I have for you here, it's one way, but it's different than the love that I have for my wife. It's different than the love that I have for my children as well. Like there's just these different varying aspects of how love operates, right? So love is, I always struggled with that too when I was a kid. I remember my mom, I'd be like, Mom, do you love me? And she's like, of course I love you. And then I remember this conversation was like, well, do you love me more than you love Dad? And she was like, no. And I really struggled as a child to understand, like, how can she love my dad more than loving me? But as an adult, I understand, like, there's varying, it's just love is different in different contexts in terms of how we define it. We talk about love as a strong enthusiasm for anything. I talk about, I love Peet's Coffee, right? I settle for Starbucks, but I love coffee. In the sport tennis, love is a score of nothing. It's like 30 love, which means that you have no points, which is kind of an interesting analogy there. But really, in most of our context today, when we talk about love, a lot of times we talk about it in the context of relationships where there's like this strong, sexual passion or desire. So we talk about it in terms of like maybe interchanging the word love for lust and lust for love. So we use love in that context as well. But we a lot of times are talking about love as well in terms of a profound, tender, passionate, and emotional affection that we have for someone else. So we'll talk about I'm falling in love with somebody, which implies that I could fall out of love with that person as well. So there's this emotional connectivity that goes with it as well. So as you can see, the word love is used in all kinds of ways in our society and our culture today. So when the word is being used, a lot of times we pick up on it. When Darren says he loves Peet Coffee, he's not saying that he loves Peet's Coffee in the same way that he loves his wife or his children. Like, it's just different, right? There's a different way that the word is being used. And so our society has, in many ways, misunderstood the complexity of the nature of love because it's used so often to relate to a really highly sexually charged environment that we live in, or this high, elated, emotional feeling that's signified by an emotional response. Like I fall in love with somebody. And so, unfortunately, what happens is that love in our context in our society today, in a lot of ways, is based on a very me-centered approach. So there's this sense of like, the idea of an action or a commitment is not as important as an emotional response. So that's why there's a lot of struggle, like in relationships. It's like, well, we felt like we were in love with each other when we got married, and we had kids together, and then over time that feeling just kind of evaporated and went away. And if that relationship was not built on a foundation of love as an action, right, beyond just an emotive response, then there's no stability in that marriage as it moves forward, because love has not been, the full nature of love has not been fully experienced in the context of marriage, because it was such a fleeting emotional situation. And so we see so much of that today. We see people get married and then people, get divorced very quickly. And there's all kinds of reasons for marriage and divorce, right? And all kinds of stuff. So I don't want to kind of just put it in one little box. But a lot of times we get married and we experience divorce because something in relation to how each partner kind of operates with one another as it relates to love in terms of the action-based need for love is not always fully experienced or actualized. Okay? And so we want to kind of unpack this and understand what love really is according to God's design. What God has designed for love and how we're to understand it. What does the Bible teach about it? There's another word, if you do a Webster's dictionary search on love, you'll see some of the things that I just talked about in terms of the descriptions of it. But Webster's also defines love in a different way as well as it relates to God. And love is also talked about there as being the benevolent affection of God for his creatures, his creation. It's also talked about love is the reverent affection due from creatures that God has made to God. So there's this loving action that's poured out to us from God, and our reciprocal response to God is also talked about as love. So you see all the love is used for all kinds of things, right? But it's this type of benevolent affection that God has for us that should be foundational to our understanding of love today. According to the Bible, love is something that God ultimately defines and embodies. So love is one of the very defining characteristics of his being. So God can never not love. God is always loving. God always loves. It is a intricately comprised component of who he is. It'd be like looking at you and saying, I don't even know the right analogy. Without your soul, right? You just exist to really be. Your soul kind of carries on beyond you. Well, it's like almost like God's soul is filled up with this love. Like that's the very key to who God is this deep love. That's why the scripture tells us that God is love. Not that just that God embodies love and that God does loving things and that he acts in love, but God by nature is love. And this has been a really encouraging thing for me recently too, as I just pay attention more. The more that I grow in my walk with God, the more I allow my mind to kind of think and grapple with things differently in terms of when I experience love in the world around us. And I think that if God is, and I may have shared this with you before, I know I say that a lot, but sometimes I forget in what context I've shared what. But you know, if God's love is really pervasive and is really foundational, is really a picture of ultimate reality, like God's presence is being fully loved, right? And so when we experience this deep sense of sacrificial love, when we experience it in our relationships with one another, when we give it towards somebody else, when we see it expressed in a like in a movie, when they're depicting like a very sacrificial, loving response or something along those lines, what we're seeing is God showing up. Because if God is love, then God shows up in so many different ways in terms of this, how love is so pervasively experienced in our world. I just think it's so amazing, because if God is omnipotent and all-powerful and God is love, then his love is actually infecting and infesting itself in so many different ways, even among many of his creatures that don't even believe in him and know him. It's like God's love is predominant. God's love is invasive, and it's all around us. And we're able to experience it. And so when we understand that, it's a beautiful thing. When I can experience a loving response from somebody else, I can thank them for that, but I can ultimately thank God, because that's God loving me through them. That's God's love that I'm experiencing. When I feel an intense desire to care for and a deep, as I've experienced a lot with this ministry I'm doing with San Jose students and Santa Clara students, I'll stand up in front of them and I'll talk to them. And I'm looking at these college students, and there's just this deep, overwhelming sense of love that I have in my heart for these students. Because I've heard some of their stories. I know some of their journey that they're on. I know how important that time of life is for them. And there's just this deep welling up in my soul of like, what can I do to support you and to pray for you and encourage you? Because I know that life is hard for you in lots of different ways, right? That love does not come from, oh, Darren's just a nice guy, and so Darren naturally thinks that way. No, if you know me at the very core of me, I'm not naturally kind of wired to just vomit love all over people, right? But God in me, and by the Spirit of God working in me, there is a sense of I have a sense of wow, this is really God giving me something that is supernatural, right? And it's a beautiful thing. That's what God desires to do in us and to do through us as his people. So when we look at the Bible, what we see is that love is to be foundational in our relationships. And that love that is to be foundational in our relationships is a caring action. It's less about what I feel and more about what I do and how I treat other people. So sometimes the emotion that we experience is something that drives us to action, right? So sometimes God has those things working together. But it always involves an active response. And so we're going to see that with the help of the Holy Spirit, we were created to love others the way that God has loved us. Through sacrificial, servant-hearted, unconditional, loving ways. And this is not easy to do. But God's desire for us is to love the way that He loves us. And friends, that is a lifelong journey. And that we'll be in conflict with in our entire life because we struggle with our new creation status and still wanting to hold on to self-centered needs and desires. And yet God is, in His Spirit within us, is creating us, in us, a desire to actively, sacrificially love. We live in this tension. It actually seems to me that all of life is a tension. All of life is this tension of the already and the not yet, right? We live in a broken world, and yet we are agents and a part of experiencing this new kingdom life. And there's tension there, right? We experience it in our own lives. We're not completely free from sin. We still struggle and slip up and make these mistakes. And yet we're deeply loved and cared for in the process, and we see ourselves moving forward in ways because God in His grace is helping us overcome things in our lives, right? We live in this tension constantly. That's part of the beauty, part of the joy of what it means to learn to depend and to trust on God as we go through life, because it's not all solved right now. It's not all fixed right now for us. I'm kind of digressing. So Pat read for us the famous love passage in 1 Corinthians 13, and that's going to be a backdrop for us this morning. And full disclosure, we are not going to. I knew when I put this message together that it was going to be too much for one Sunday. Okay, so I'm not going to get through all this. I'll probably do half of it, and then we'll do the other half next week. But in order to properly understand love in this chapter, we need to understand something important about the town of Corinth. So Paul wrote 1 Corinthians 13. Paul wrote to the church, the called out ones, the people of Jesus that lived in this city called Corinth. And it's so important to understand this, right, in our context of reading the Scriptures. Everything we read in the Scriptures is written within a context. It's like today, when I speak a sermon here, I am communicating something within a context. I'll communicate using language or things that I know about you, or in terms of our current environment in the world today, it will be spoken within a specific context. If I were to take my sermon and I were to try to go and speak it to a group of people 400 years from now, they may listen to me speaking and go, "What are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't resonate with where we are and what our culture's like today," right? So the Scriptures, super important as we read the Scriptures to understand what is going on in the time that it was written. That this is not a static message that was just written that we read today and we say, well, this is exactly what God is saying to our church today. It's like, well, maybe, yes, there are principles that are there, right? But remember, Paul wrote this, inspired by the Holy Spirit, to a church, a group of people in a town called Corinth, specifically. And he knew the people there, right? And he addressed things related to the people there. The town of Corinth in Jesus' day, or not in Jesus' day, but in the time when Paul is writing, probably in Jesus' day as well, but Corinth was a very sexually charged environment. Probably very much like ours today. Very dominant, like sexuality, exploring sexuality, all kinds of things related to that was very much a part of our culture today, in our world, very much a part of the culture in Corinth as well. No doubt that they struggled to have an accurate understanding of what love is, like we do today. We don't get it today. Maybe some of us here are starting to get it, or we get it because we understand the nature of God's love. But for those in our world, people are all over the map, and they don't understand really what love is, right? Beyond this emotive sexual response, generally speaking. And that's very similar to what it was for Corinth. And so it's in this context that Paul is going to speak about love. And it's going to look differently than the way a sexually charged environment will see it, because love is going to be less about you, it's less about me, it's more about sacrifice and servanthood towards others. Right? So that's a big shift that we have to change. When I think of love today, first of all, when you probably think of it, it's probably something like there's a desire, a feeling, an emotion that I have for something else, or for someone else, or I want to love someone else like this. It's very much like there's a very self-centered, not that that's not a bad thing. God's created us that way, right? But it's very much an internal, self-oriented way of looking at it that's based a lot of times on, I just want to feel a certain way about somebody or something. And it's very feeling driven. But when we look at what God says about love, what we see Paul talking about in Corinthians is that love is predominantly action-driven, right? And it's through an action-driven love that emotions will support. And emotions should then lead us back. So it's a cyclical effect that goes on here. But a lot of times we leave actions out of it. A lot of times because actions take work, right? So when I counsel, and it's kind of funny that I do marriage counseling for couples because I'm not perfect in marriage. My wife will tell you that. But I know, the good thing is I know the answers. Doesn't mean I necessarily do them all the time. That I'm actually doing it perfectly all the time. But when I talk with couples, that there's always this sense of I'd be happy to work through I have some material that I use for counseling, and I'd be happy to work with you through those things, but it's really important that, is that something that you want to do? And not just you, but is it something that your spouse wants to do? Because you can't really improve a marriage if both husband and wife are not actually both invested in saying we want to do the work to improve it, right? If only one of them says, I want to do the work, and the other one says no, I can work with you, to help you become the kind of person that God wants you to be in this marriage. But if your spouse isn't going to partner with you in that, then it's going to be a challenge, right? There's going to be some challenges. So the optimal, and I've done that before. I've worked with one, and sometimes it works out, and other times it doesn't. But the best thing to do is to try to get both, because the idea is that I can sit in a room with both husband and wife, and I can say, we can look together and say, these are the actions in the work that you need to do. These are the actions in the work that you need to do together. You're both contributing to this in order to make it succeed. So it's very action driven. It's very not just an emotive response, but a very action based way of operating that is fueled by sacrificial love and servanthood. That's a key thing, right? To be people that are sacrificially and serving and loving those around us. So let me jump in here to a couple things, and then I'll pause for today. Still doing okay on time, so that's good. So 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 1 through 3. So let's look back at this section of scripture that Pat read for us. Paul again writing here says, if I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, that's pretty powerful, actually. He's making a very powerful statement. If I can speak in the tongues of men or angels, but I don't have love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging. I'm just making a ton of noise. And it's annoying noise, right? If I have the gift of prophecy, and I can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, it reminds me of King Solomon, right? Wisest human being that ever lived, according to the scriptures. If I have this gift of prophecy, I'm wise, I have all this knowledge, and I have faith that can move mountains. So not like a small faith, but I have really powerful, strong faith in God, but I don't have love, I am nothing. It doesn't say I'm partially inadequate. It says I have nothing. If I give everything I possess to the poor, I give away all my income, sell all my possessions, and give it away to those in need, and if I give over my body to hardship, that I may boast. Look at what I did. I gave up even my physical life for the sake of God. But I don't have love, I gain nothing. So what is this love that Paul is referring to? I know I've shared this with you in the past, but in the Greek language, there are essentially 3 different words for love. Okay? As opposed to English, we just use one word for love. I love my wife and I love Pete's coffee. We're talking about 2 different things there. Probably should be a different word used there, right? I love my wife and I like Pete's coffee. That may be better, okay? But in Greek, the Greek language has these three different words, which is where you can start to see some of the problems and understanding in our English what's being communicated to us. So the first word for love that in the Greek language is the word philia. Okay, and you immediately think of the city Philadelphia, right? Which I think is so ironic because Philadelphia has the most hostile, hateful, they're characteristically known as the most hateful and hostile fans in all sports, right? The people of Philadelphia. And yet Philadelphia its name means the city of brotherly love. That's what the name Philadelphia means, the city of brotherly love. So philia love is a friendship-based love, loyalty to friends or to family. Like there's this sense that in many respects, all of us here have a philia love for each other. Like we love each other and care for each other as friends, as part of a church family. There's a sense of care and mutual respect and concern. You're valuable, you're important, we matter to each other, right? That's that philia love. When I say I love you, that would be kind of, in this context, that would be kind of undergirding that kind of understanding of love. There's also another word for love in the Greek language, and it's the word eros, which you can kind of do the math on that. Like that's where we get our word erotic in English, right? So this is a very intimate, romantic, passionate, sexual love. It can be very feelings-based. You're overwhelmed with this emotion that leads to a sexual response, so to speak, right? So that's eros love. Okay? But in this passage, what's the word for love? Paul is not using the word philia when he talks about love in this passage. He's not talking about brotherly love. He's not talking about sexual love, eros. The word that Paul is using here is the word agape. The word is agape. And this agape love, the understanding or the definition of this love is God's response to humanity. This is God's covenantal love, so to speak, for humans, based on his actions and following through on his promises. God always loves agape by coming through on what he's covenantally said he was going to do. And so when he tells his people that he's going to enter into covenant with them and he's going to give them certain things and do certain things for them, God's agape love is what drives him covenantally to make good on those commitments. So it's very action, it's very commitment driven. It is also the agape is the expected human reciprocal love for God. Right? So you can see that, like, God doesn't want us just to love him as like a friend, like, oh, I care about you, right? Definitely God doesn't want us to think of him in terms of like this sensual or sexual component of love. There's this agape, this covenantal, this experiential, this active-based response to God. You will love me if you do what I command. See, that's when Jesus talks about loving God by doing what I command. Those things are intertwined together. They connect with one another. Love is demonstrated by obedience to what I ask you to do. That is an active response of love. That is agape love. This agape love is God's love. It's divine, it's unconditional, it's self-sacrificing, it's active, it's volitional, and it's thoughtful. And so taking into account these first three verses, Paul is saying, if I can speak in tongues, right? This is a sign of the Holy Spirit's indwelling presence in our lives. If I can speak in tongues, if I can prophesy, if I have all knowledge, if I have a deep faith that could, in Jesus' languages, can say, that mountain, I command you in faith that you move yourself physically from that place to that place. If you have this powerful, deep faith to move mountains, if you give sacrificially so much as to become poor, if you become a martyr and you suffer for your faith, and you do not have this God-sized agape love, I am merely nothing and gaining nothing. That sounds like borderline heresy. God's got to somehow up in heaven have some checklist saying, well, good Darren, good Darren, good Darren, good. Okay, well, yeah, you didn't get an A on the test because you left off the agape part, but at least you did the other things. No, Paul is saying, if you don't have agape, you fail. No matter how good you've been, no matter all the things that you've done in God's name, if it is not fueled by agape love, it is failing. And so agape love is very, very important. That we love effectively is very, very important to our lives. It is what should drive us in all of our actions towards others and towards God. And not a sexual love, not a brotherly love, not an emotive love, but a very action, sacrificial, unconditional, giving type of love. So, I'll share one point this morning and then I'll save the rest for next time. Okay? Point 1 on your handout. I actually made it to the first top of the handout. So, point one, God's agape love needs to be foundational to our lives. God's agape love needs to be foundational to our lives. So again, contextualizing this in our current day and age today. If I make a 6-figure salary and I don't have God's agape love, I am nothing. If I have a nice big house, I drive a nice expensive car, but I don't have God's agape love, I am nothing. If I'm a good pastor and a decent preacher, but don't have God's agape love, I am nothing. If I am a good athlete, a great student, or both, but I don't have God's love, I have nothing. If I know 100 Bible verses from memory, but I don't have love, I am nothing. I mean, this is what Paul is telling us here. Not that you physically are nothing, that you're worthless, but you have nothing. That you've missed the point of living. You've missed the point of life. Paul is being very clear that without God's agape love as foundational and at the core of our lives, our very lives will be running towards things that are pointless. There's no basis. The foundational basis for what you were created, how we are created to live, is not being actualized. Our whole life should be driven around learning how to love God and others the way that He loves us. Like, it's simple in that way. What is the right response? Love. What does God want from me? Trust Him and love other people. It is so incredibly simple, theoretically and on paper. We all know how hard that is, right? Last I checked, it's not real easy to love people sacrificially and unconditionally. Maybe it's just me. But it's hard, especially people that do you wrong. Especially people that don't like you, that have done bad, sometimes it's just really difficult, right? But Paul is saying that it's really important that love, this agape love, is foundational to the core of our lives. All other understandings and definitions of love are partial expressions of the kind of God love that He wants to be foundational in our lives. According to the Greek language, God's agape love must be rooted foundationally, and then other types of love will spring forth from it. Stronger brotherly love, stronger eros love will come as a result of that rootedness, that foundation. I remember when Cheryl and I first started dating, people gave us a hard time. I don't know how much I've shared this with you or not, but in college, I was dating Cheryl's roommate. So, and she was her best friend to top it off. So, yeah, there you go. So, anyway, so I was dating Cheryl's roommate, and I started dating her, Cheryl's roommate, our freshman year of college. And it was in the spring semester. So we started dating. Her name was Angie, and we started dating in the spring. And then she was going to be moving. Angie was going to be moving from Santa Rosa to somewhere in the Midwest, I think Oklahoma or someplace. And this is back in 1991. So this is before cell phones, right? And she's moving. She was going to be on the road with her family. They were going to do a whole summer tour from Santa Rosa to wherever they were going to move. So it was one of those things where I was completely dependent on my girlfriend I had no way to contact her. I had nowhere to send her mail. I had no phone number, right? And so I told her, I says, Angie, I need, you've got my number and you've got my address. I don't know how to get a hold of you. And all summer long, like she didn't talk to me all summer long. And I still remember that, I could go to my mailbox, I would keep looking for a letter in the mailbox. Every day I used to go, I was like, where's the letter? No letter, no letter. Yeah, I was so devastated. And so at that time I started to call, I had Cheryl's phone number, so I called her, because she and I had started to become friends, because I had met her through her roommate. And so I called, put Cheryl in a tough spot, because I called her and I said, hey, Cheryl, do you know anything about what's going on with Angie? Because she hasn't written me, she hasn't called me, I don't know how to get a hold of her. And meanwhile, I think Angie had been communicating to Cheryl. It's just like, I'm not sure that I'm all that into Darren, And so she kind of, instead of just like cutting me off and saying, hey, dude, it ain't going to work, she just didn't say anything, right? And so Cheryl was in the middle of this. Anyway, long story short, we get back to school in the fall, and I finally talked to my girlfriend after 3 months. And I'm like, what in the world? And she still wouldn't come around to, anyway, we broke up in the fall. And yeah, it's pretty much a done deal. But I know I spent time so what I did at that time is I started to spend a lot more time with Cheryl at that time. And so we would walk the track at Point Loma, big old track there, and we'd just walk around and talk, and we became really, really good friends. And there was no like attraction that we had for each other at that point. We were just friends. She was a friend of mine. I mean, I thought she was good looking, but there wasn't anything there at that point. And so we're walking the track, and we started to develop this friendship. And then at one point, and it was still, I still remember, October 19th, 1991 is when I first asked Cheryl to be my girlfriend. And I kissed her on the same night that I asked her to be my girlfriend, so kind of crazy. But October 19th, 1991, and we started a relationship at that point. And I remember all the friend chatter that we got because of it. It was like, oh, this is a rebound relationship, it's like it'll never last, which I kind of laugh at today, and I go, yeah, look, 28 years later, it's still going. But the point was that the reason why Cheryl in my relationship had gone through snags, as any relationship has over the years. But the thing that rooted us very early in our relationship was this strong relationship that was not based in emotive feelings. It was very much about action and caring for the other person and serving the other person. And so that idea, that agape concept of love, of looking to meet the other person's needs, how can I support you? How can I help you? I'm not trying to gain anything out of this, but I'm trying to respond. And I didn't think of it at that time as God's agape love, right? But I was acting in a very unconditional, sacrificial, and even more so Cheryl towards me in that way. And that provided, the point of that whole story is it provided the foundation for us to then build a relationship that had all the other elements of love that came to be a part of it, because the rooting was established in this unconditional, sacrificial care for one another, right? And so the point there is that God desires for us to have that rootedness in our lives as we relate to everybody, as we relate to all people. God sees that with us. He handles himself that way with us. He calls us to live those lives of sacrificial agape love towards other people. And this, if we look at the world around us, we see the way relationships are destroyed with one another all over the place in our world. That's because this agape love is not ultimately foundational for so many people. And that's why so many relationships get messed up in the process, whether they be marital or work partnerships or friendships or family relationships, any relationship you think of. If it's not rooted in agape love, sacrificial, unconditional, sacrificial love, it's not rooted with the right foundation in place. And so the point being, and we're going to continue this next week, is that God has created us to be people, building block of community, that God's agape love is rooted and foundational to all successful and healthy community. Right? It has to be. It's unconditional, sacrificial. It's active oriented, right? So don't think emotions first, think action first. How can I actively love and care in the ways that God has called me to, right? And so that is a snapshot of agape love. So we will continue with that and look at the other 4 points next Sunday. So I'll just reprint the sermon insert, maybe fill in the top one for you next week in there so that you have it. But then we'll jump in. What I want to encourage you to do, though, this week is take some time this week and maybe read through that 1 Corinthians 13 love chapter. Read it through several times this week. Really just sit with those words, the passages that are there. We'll jump in at verse 4 next week. Love is patient, love is kind. Working through that whole list, right? And so take some time to process that and to think through that before we come back next Sunday. So, yes, Jean.
Thinking of agape love.